engineer on guides, the songs of warblers of North America, Audubon Society Voices of Hawaii Birds, and the Cornell Lab Guides to Bird Sounds, as well as a couple others. He's been a tour guide leader for Victor Emmanuel Nature Tours. He's written finch species accounts for breeding bird atlases and birds of the world, and the Pennsylvania Breeding Bird Atlas, as we were talking beforehand. He co-authored with Doug Gross the pine siskin and red crossbill accounts in the second Breeding Bird Atlas of Pennsylvania. And he has published several papers about the red crossbill vocal complex and is the president and founder of the Finch Research Network, or FiRN. So I hope you're all excited about his presentation tonight. It's called From Finches to the Launching of the Finch Research Network. And with that, I'll let Matt share his slides and he can begin telling us all about that. Thanks for being here tonight, Matt.
And Matt, please remember to share your sound when you share your slides.
Let's see here. All right. Thank you again there, David, for that great introduction. And thanks. I'd like to thank Pennsylvania Society for Ornithology for having me, and everybody else that's been involved with this great organization for many years. It's always a great pleasure. I love talking to people about finches. I think anybody that knows me at all, there's a few in this crowd tonight, I can talk about finches for an awful long time. This is a picture of me on a Victor Emmanuel Nature Tour guide that I led about 5-6 years ago in the Olympic Peninsula. And I always like to give everybody a little bit of a background about myself. As David mentioned, I started out, my first love was meteorology, believe it or not. That was, kind of where my interest in science started. And when I finished my my water resources meteorology kind of degree at SUNY Oneonta, the last month I was at Oneonta in 1995, that would have been spring of 95. That last month I took a continuing ed class in birding through Audubon. And that's kind of where I started to bird a little bit. In fact, that last 4 weeks, I took a class, I bought a pair of binoculars, I bought a car, I went and saw a Grateful Dead concert, and then I got up the next day and drove cross country to Yellowstone. And that's kind of where, my moment in time in life kind of pivoted. I did not obviously know it at the time necessarily, but I arrived in Yellowstone. I took a job as a host in the Lake Yellowstone Inn. And I grabbed my binoculars. When I first arrived there, I grabbed my binoculars. I went to Lower Falls. And I was at Lower Falls, and a flock of red crossbills came in above me. Obviously, at the time, I didn't know them by sound all that well. But I remember looking up with my newly bought binoculars, going, what a crazy adaptation, as the seed coats kind of kept falling down upon me. And again, I did not know it at that moment, but literally at that moment, my life pretty much switched. Talk about a moment of some ornithotherapy there. It certainly was, an enriching moment that just I have never looked back from that moment. But again, it's now that I can kind of reflect over the last several years, I can reflect on what an impact that moment had on my life. I was in Yellowstone for about 3 months. And then I took a position in AmeriCorps, which, everybody doesn't know AmeriCorps. It's like a domestic-based Peace Corps. It was one of the only residential programs of AmeriCorps at the time. In fact, it was the first full year of AmeriCorps, and we were based at Mount Adams, which is kind of the Lost Mountain in the Cascades. And that's where my finch interest continued to just kind of take off from there. There was a gentleman that was leading weekly bird walks, and I would go out on these bird walks. And I realized at that point I had an ability to identify birds by sound. And we were doing these carnivore. One of the projects I was working on was a carnivore camera set project. We would snowshoe into these remote areas to see if there were pine marten and Canada lynx. And the birds I could always rely on, because it's coniferous forest out there. The birds I could always rely on on these snowshoe treks that were sometimes quite a ways in were pine siskins and red crossbills and even grosbeaks, and that's really where it all started for me. Next slide is cold weather parrots. I want to give you a little taste of that moment in time that changed my life at Yellowstone, at Lower Falls. Obviously, it's not the same species, but I want to play this video for you, which is spectacular in my opinion, but I'm a little bit biased, obviously.
Of the 10,000 bird species on Earth, only 5, all in the finch family, have crossed bills. The white-winged crossbill is found in the higher latitudes of North America, traveling from coast to coast in large flocks in search of white spruce trees. Females are greenish-yellow, males red, and both have 2 distinct white bars on the wings. Their unique crossed bill, with the lower mandible curving under the upper maxilla, is adapted to reach heavily protected seeds found under tough cone scales. To reach the seeds, a white-wing places the tip of the curved lower mandible against the cone while inserting the upper maxilla under the scale. Beak partially open, the bird uses the curved mandible as a lever, twisting his head as he pries up the scale. He eats the seed, discarding the husk. The curve of the mandible provides the leverage needed to force the scale up, enabling crossbills to feed on seeds that are not accessible to other species. A white-wing often twists the cone off and carries it to a perch where it holds the cone in one claw and rotates it like a corn cob.
Those are seed coats dropping, by the way.
Lower mandibles cross either left or right, and each individual always holds the cone in the claw toward which their mandible curves. This ensures that the tip of the mandible is facing the cone, giving the bird the best leverage to quickly pluck the seeds. White-wings are remarkably efficient at harvesting their food. An individual bird can eat up to 3,000 seeds per day. Crossbills are able to swiftly bypass a conifer's armor as a direct result of their specialized beaks, an excellent example of evolutionary adaptation.
So as you can see, there were seed coats that were dropping there. So that was literally kind of what I was experienced there at Yellowstone when I first arrived there and went to Lower Falls. That was a flock of white-wings that I found like in '08, just in a county adjacent to me. I live in Cortland, New York, kind of between Syracuse and Ithaca, and so brought a crew out there from Cornell and shot the footage, and I helped write some of the narration for that piece. So getting to these next slides, this next section of this, I kind of want to, I don't want people to get too bogged down in the many eBird maps. I know Holly's talking later about eBird, but just wanted to give a little bit of review of last year and what we are looking at going into the next this next winter here. Last year was this superflight of finches out of the boreal forest. How we define superflight is all 8 of the boreal finches basically moved out of the boreal in mass, in large numbers. And we had not seen that like that in, 2012, 2013, we had what some would consider a superflight. Certainly 97, 98 was the last unbelievable superflight. So why such an eruption of finches last year, and what are we looking at moving forward? And I want to kind of bring Pennsylvania into this discussion a little bit, because Pennsylvania is interesting because it's kind of the bridge between the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, and some eruptions don't quite make it to Pennsylvania. And I want to give you a little insight on what I think you might be looking at this upcoming year, which we did not cover in the winter finch forecast, which was just released by the Finch Research Network and Tyler Orr, who is a board member of the Finch Research Network, just this past Sunday. So the main drivers of this are, kind of high reproductive success, a number of years, which that is driven by often, there could be natural cycles, but there's usually generational cone crops that develop. When I say generational cone crops, meaning bumper or amazing or excellent cone crops that form once every, 15, 20 years. The other thing that's been going on for the last 6, 7, 8 years is there's been 4 major spruce budworm outbreaks in the eastern boreal forest. Now, a lot of people don't think of finches as a budworm specialist, but believe it or not, evening grosbeaks and purple finches and even pine siskins to some degree will opportunistically, even crossbills are actually known to eat a fair number of insects. People don't realize that. But if there's a really, really common protein-rich resource, birds are opportunistic. I mean, almost any species will utilize a really easily accessible protein-rich food source. Most people kind of see budworm specialists as Cape May warblers and Tennessee warblers, but again, evening grosbeak numbers seem to be pretty tied to these budworm outbreaks. And that has led to high reproductive success. And then last year, we had a crash in the food crop, going into the wintertime. The cone crops were poor, the birch crops were poor, and those birds just flooded out of the boreal forest. In fact, a lot of people in Canada were like, there's no finches left in Canada. Now, moving it forward this year, it's not going to be a bust year. Now, will that make it to Pennsylvania? I think that's yet to be determined, obviously. I think you will see purple finches. I think you'll see some siskins. I'm hopeful there will be isolated pockets of evening grosbeaks too, because those numbers are high and birds are on the move somewhat right now. So you're kind of looking at a combination of the coniferous breeding finches. The 2 crossbills and the siskins will be breeding across a portion of the northeast and southeastern Canada. But there'll be a small echo flight. What we call echo flight is like a small flight post superflight year or post, big eruption year of evening grosbeak, purple finches, and pine siskins as well to some degree. So I think some of these will make it to Pennsylvania. Clearly, purple finches and purple finches breed in Pennsylvania anyway. But I think you will see some pine siskins, and there might be some nesting pine siskins come like February, March. And I think you'll have a few pockets of evening grosbeaks, which I don't know the last time there's actually been 2 winters in a row you've had both. So I'm just going to go, this is a slide. I'm not, you can see Finch superflights there. 97, 98 was the last ridiculous one. 2012, 13 was just a notch below last year's, I would say. And that graph on the right there, or that diagram on the right, kind of gives an idea of what these species feed on. And you can see purple finch and evening grosbeak feed in the spruce budworm. Pine siskin, I like this chart, but I'm not a huge fan of it for pine siskin because pine siskin really is the generalist of all of the finches. They're part red poll in that they'll feed on birch catkins. They're part goldfinches, they'll feed on weed seeds. They're part crossbill, they'll feed on coniferous seed. They're part budworm specialist. So just to give a little bit review, and I'm going to go through these fairly quick because I know we don't have a ton of time. And in some of these maps, I kind of tried to I was originally trying to pull up maps from last year, this time, like August, September, compared to this year. But purple finch doesn't really show much difference between last year and this year for this time period, for August, September, because these events often really start to ramp up in October. But you can see the overall eruption of last year, the intensity of the movement. The birds really were super, super common in the southern part of the United States. We kind of had some around in the Northeast, but it's really southeastern America that there were a ton of purple finches. And they made it all the way to central Florida last year. Red polls last year, again, I'm not going to do comparative maps between last year and this year because red polls are pretty much one of the last ones to erupt every winter. We might get a trickle of red polls. There's a little bit of a wild card at play this year that could push the event to something better than we're predicting. And those things are, again, how high are the population numbers? There was an unbelievable number of wildfires across the boreal forest this year. And there was significant drought as well. So these wildfires, how much habitat was destroyed up there? And how much food, potential food was destroyed this year? Could be a wild card to push red polls to us, but it's really, really hard to predict that. Hoary red poll last year, you know, on the Finches Eruptions and Mass Crops Facebook page. I know some people in this group are part of that. Joe Geikus actually started that group. Thanks again out there. Shout out to Joe. You know, there was a red poll fever last year. There was just so many people sending people, you know, at Finch Research Network to ID whether there was a hoary red poll or not a hoary red poll. It was a lot of fun. Now, getting to pine siskin, now I did do a comparative map a little bit. You can see the intensity again of the movement last year was just unbelievable in the south. I mean, a lot of them departed the northeast. You know, Audubon ran that article last year that the siskin took over the country. There was a flock of, I think, upwards of 20 in the Everglades. That is not a mistake in the eBird map. There were pine siskins and red-breasted nuthatches in Bermuda. It was just an amazing event. So here was the map last year at this time. And here's the map this year at this time. So you can kind of see the shrinking in the east. Siskins you could see in September. Last year compared to this year had already been spilling out of the northern parts of Canada, or states to the north of Pennsylvania. Yeah, you can see there's not a lot to the south here. People don't realize siskins do nest along the spine of the Appalachians. A lot of people don't realize that, actually. Red crossbill, again, you're going to have to look kind of closely, but don't hurt yourself too much on this. You can see the map this year. Red crossbills, which is this eastern type 10, which we're going to describe as a new call type here in the next couple of weeks, type 12. You can see that the abundance of this bird, which is mostly these type 12 birds in the northeast, the concentration of them were to the north, which is typical. Last year, you could see they moved down in numbers to some degree, and the ridiculous white pine crop that developed last year. And this was the overall map for the winter time. You know, so there was quite a bit of movement to the south last year of this northeastern bird. White-winged crossbill, again, kind of hard to tell, but white wings and reds will be breeding across, they're actually breeding now, or just wrapping up breeding in Maine, New Hampshire, Adirondacks. You know, you could see that there's a little bit more of a concentration here in the northeast. And you can also see there's been a bit more of a movement in the mountain west. They'll use Engelmann spruce pretty regularly out west. And here's the map for last year this time. So a little bit lower intensities. You know, these eBird maps, I sometimes wish they would, you know, have a little bit more of a gradation of the intensity, because if you have one, it shows up as a block. But just to show you again, you can see some deeper purples down here in the northeastern states, also birds in Utah. You know, Pennsylvania, again, is one of the states, it's like, does the event, you know, obviously white-winged crossbills is not a bird that typically makes it to Pennsylvania. Here was the overall map last year for white-winged crossbill. Probably the one that did not erupted the least amount compared to, you know, the rest of the finches in the superflight. Now, this is probably a bird that is a nemesis for a number of people in Pennsylvania at this point. You know, there was a lot of interest in, will pine grosbeak make it to Pennsylvania? I don't think there were any records for pine grosbeak last year. I did try to tweak out a little bit, just run some basic maps in eBird comparing pre-1990 to post 1990 or 91, I should say. And you can see here there were quite a few records in Pennsylvania and points south of actually pine grosbeak from 1990 to 1900 to 1990. Most of those records in Pennsylvania, there was unbelievable events for all of the finches. There were several actually superflight events, or what could be categorized as great eruptions or superflights in the 70s, which was the tail end or at the peak of the last spruce budworm outbreak. Actually, there was two major spruce budworm outbreaks in North America that were well documented. There was a 1945 to 55, and then a 1968 to 1988. And the 70s were right in the center of that peak of abundance of the spruce budworm outbreak. Now, pine grosbeak isn't necessarily a spruce budworm species. However, I think it was space in the name now. He gave a presentation to Pennsylvania for Joe and the group. He wrote a paper on finches, on how the defoliation of the boreal forest by spruce budworm can also lead to subsequent eruptions later years after that, because there's no food up there. So that, the events come down. But you can see, I think it was over 90, it was like somewhere around 91 or 92% of all pine grosbeak records in Pennsylvania occurred, at least that's in eBird, occurred prior to 1991. Last year, there was this amazing event. A lot of our birds just spilled out of the boreal forest or out of the Maritimes. Look at time there. Evening grosbeak. So the darlings of the finch group, and there's not a lot to really see in the differences in these maps here, but you can see a little bit of a difference between last year and this year. So there's a difference kind of between the current year and last year. There was a couple records to the south. Evening grosbeak events don't really start to pick up until October, but you can see the event last year, October, or at least through March. There was a bird in the panhandle of Florida. There was a bird in Orlando. Almost all of the southeastern states got in on the event, which it was the first time that most of the southern states actually had evening grosbeak since the 80s. So it was 30 years. In fact, Tyler, when we were on Badgerland birding this past week, said it was, the eruption out of the boreal was perhaps the best evening grosbeak eruption in 40 years, he thought, at least from what was viewed in Ontario. So again, evening grosbeak species of special concern. We worked with David's group, the Heritage Program, Pennsylvania Heritage Program, and Powder Mill, and Western PA Land Conservancy. Hopefully, I'm not forget Carnegie. On the wintering grosbeak project that they've been working on, and we helped, supply some tags for that project. So you can see here, evening grosbeak has had a 92% decline over the last 50 years. It's been most dramatic, I would say, since about 1990, 1985, 1990, which coincides with that last spruce budworm outbreak. So again, will they make it? I'm very curious. Will there be pockets of evening grosbeaks in Pennsylvania this year, which will be indicative of how intense the budworm outbreaks have been and how high the population numbers have stayed, even post a superflight like last year? Because there's always a certain amount of mortality with these major eruptions. Birds, these finches generally want to stay to the north, and migration is costly. A lot of people don't know, so I'm going to kind of move into some of the call type stuff that I've been working on for the last 20 years, 25 years, which is really kind of, I think with Red Crossbill more than anything, is where I've kind of, I guess, made my name for myself a little bit. But there are 5 call types of evening grosbeaks. I got to put this in there because a lot of people don't realize this. We only get type 3 here in the East, although there was one record. It was just published in the Iowa Journal. There was a type 1 evening grosbeak in Iowa, which was the farthest east for that type. Type 1 is the eruptive type throughout the West. The records are actually, there's recordings of type 1 from the Mexico border all the way to Alaska, actually. But type 3 really is the only one we get in the east. And type 1 would be the only one I would expect to possibly show up in the east in a flock of type 3s. When I talk call types, what is a call type? So with crossbills and grosbeaks, you know, finches generally make a flight call when they fly over. And with these flight calls is an implied ecological specialization that's often tied to differences in bill sizes, which is tied to differences in foraging ability on different types of foods in the area that the call type is most common. But before I go into a little bit more into the weeds of a call type, I just want to cover quickly learning the sounds and how to read a spectrograph. Yes, I'm using a Crested Oropendola here for dramatic reasons. I'm going to play this at normal speed. So that's a Crested Oropendola at normal speed, and here it is at half speed. Kind of sounds like somebody taking their finger and running it over a comb, in my opinion. But you can see this is a signature of the bird's voice. Pretty cool, pretty dramatic, especially when you slow it down. Our ears have a hard time processing sound at normal speed. That's why I'm doing that there. All right, so evening grosbeak call types. I'm not going to go into great detail on this. There are 5 call types. I have 2 different spectrographs showing type 3s. There might be a 6th call type that we're trying to figure out at the Finch Research Network. Here's type 1, which is probably the most distinctive. Again, this is the Western eruptive evening grosbeak. It's the only one that really moves around the West. I'd love to poll people, the Uber birders in this group, of how many would call that on first guess an evening grosbeak. It's super pure tone whistle. In my opinion, these other ones sound a bit more like our eastern bird. Kind of a birdie quality. Only found in the Sierra, the Sierras of California, really. There was a record in Utah last year of type 2. Type 3 is our bird. And then type 4 is the Southern Rockies. Kind of short, it's a short burst. So, you know, crossbills, that's kind of where, you know, my career started to kind of narrow a little bit. I've been a finch person my whole life, as several of you out there know that, from Joe to David to Holly to Matt Sarver. I think he's in the crowd too. Matt's listened to this spiel from me for decades at this point. But yeah, crossbills, you know, there's this vocal complex, and there's kind of an evolving or maybe even incipient speciation thing going on. There's 11 or 12. We're going to describe type 12 here, hopefully soon, in the next few weeks, of red crossbill, this northeastern bird. And let me just show this video again. This video is just awesome. Tom Johnson. Again, you can kind of see, hopefully this will work. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. I guess I crashed the system. That's to be expected. Everybody there? Hopefully everybody's with me here. Let me just go back to.
Yeah, we're all still here. Just
good.
take your time to get it back up. These
All right.
things happen.
Yeah, they do. That one might be pushing the system. We got a lot of people on tonight too.
We do. Everyone has their video off, but I don't know if you want to give it another shot.
Let me try it one more time. Wait till you see his tongue come out. Pretty cool stuff. I'm obviously pretty biased. I never get tired of looking at crossbills or finches in general. I do, I do love a lot of other birds, warblers in particular. Here's again, red crossbill call types. Don't get into the weeds looking at these. These are just kind of the differences in the shapes of what they look like on, let me just go back there again, on a spectrograph. And then, for people that don't know, we actually have a new crossbill species that was described just a few years ago. It's a very interesting, why study these cryptic species group? Well, there could be additional cryptic species that are embedded in some of these groups. I think there's actually a better chance that Evening Grosbeak, there could be a cryptic species in it. But a few years ago, type 9 was elevated to species status, is now known as the Crested Crossbill. Back in the late 90s, Professor Dr. Craig Bankman at University of Wyoming asked himself the question, is there a mountain range east of the Rockies that has a local variety of lodgepole pine, and is it in an area with an absence of tree squirrels? So if you have squirrels, they drive cone evolution. If you take tree squirrels out of the equation, crossbills actually drive cone evolution. So these two mountain ranges in Idaho, he found that there was this local variant of lodgepole pine, and there were no tree squirrels. And he started studying them, started doing a mark recapture study on them, and found out over the 20 years that, he started to, look at them even closer, looked at the genetics, found that they were monophyletic, and that the birds were assortatively mating with their own call type 9 at the time, Crested Crossbill, at more than 99% of the time. And type 2s and 5s regularly move in and out of the South Hills. He also found that they only really bred in a narrower time frame than the rest of the call types. The rest of the call types are much more nomadic. This was a resident population, densities that much higher. The spectrograph was that much different too, the flight call, I should say. So that's why we're looking at it. Now, I'm not going to get into too much the crossbill weeds either. Pennsylvania is interesting in that there really isn't an abundance of red crossbills that we know of, even from a breeding perspective, year after year after year. Type 1 would be the one that you would, expect to see or hear the most in Pennsylvania. In fact, I think it was Jeff Groth, who's the one that studied these crossbill or described the crossbill call types, sent a recording to Doug Gross, I think Dutch Mountain, maybe, if I have my location correct, if that's Pennsylvania or not. Sent a recording to Jeff in the 80s or 90s, and it was, I think it was a type 1. So here's a type 1. Very quick, dry, sharp flight call. So here's the unfolding story of this type 10. So in it was 2010, Ken Irwin found an abundance of a population along the Sitka Belt along the Pacific Northwest. It was described as a new call type. Groth actually did record a few of these birds, but he lumped them in with type 4. When I started looking at this 20 years ago or 15, 20 years ago, I started looking at these birds in the Northeast, which unbelievably, Bankman did his PhD at SUNY Albany, and Groth did his PhD at Virginia Tech. They never really adequately sampled the Northeast that much, or the Great Lakes for that matter. But this recording of this northeastern bird goes back to the 50s. So here I'm just going to play type 4 quickly. You can kind of see how it was lumped, this northeastern bird was lumped in with type 4 or type 10 even. So this is the most distinctive, really, is type 4, down up. Pretty rare in the Northeast. It's a little more common in the Great Lakes. I think the first record came in for Pennsylvania of type 4, maybe 2 winters ago or last winter. So here's type 10. Just an up sweep. Now, I understand that I've listened to far too many crossbills and recordings of finches than any healthy human being on the planet. So these differences are very distinctive to my ears, but they would not necessarily be distinctive to a lot of people. So here's this bird that I've been looking at for, like I said, the better part of the last 10, 20 years. It's an up down. It's very dry, husky kind of sound. And pretty different, in my opinion. Kind of intermediate in bill size between type 10 and type 4. You know, the cool thing was I was at a local, one of my local patches last winter, and there were, lots of these all the birds in Pennsylvania last winter. Almost all of them were the birds this type 10 I just played for you. Let me just go back again here. Were pretty good records of this tall type in Pennsylvania last year. There were some at least. But I was at my local patch, and there was a flock of this type 10, 12. We're going to describe as type 12 very soon. And I was with Jay McGowan and Zach Coda, I think, about a half an hour from my house. And a type 4 flew in from a distance, landed in a tree in front of us, and called for about 5 minutes. And, at the end of that 5 minutes, a flock of like 6, 7 of these type 10, 12 birds flew in, landed in the tree next to the type 4. They sat there and kind of went back and forth for 3 or 4 minutes. And, this is what is just, to me, spine-tingling great, was after doing this for 3 or 4 minutes, the type 4 then flew off by itself in its own direction. And the type, these type 10, 12s flew off in the other direction. These birds know how to tell each other apart. Type 3, moving on to type 3, and I'm going to cover these type, the 3 main call types you would see in Pennsylvania would be type 1, this northeastern bird that we're going to describe, and type 3. Type 3 erupts. It's the most eruptive in the Northeast. When it shows up, it can actually become the most common one by quite a bit. It's also the smallest billed one in North America. And it will breed in parts of the Northeast as well. Again, kind of a zigzag up, down, or down, up, down. play this one too. Kind of a flat sounding bird to me. It's kind of weak and squeaky and flat sounding. So, moving on to the Finch Research Network. So, this has been kind of a project that's been somewhat in the works, kind of at least a thought, going back to the a trip I co-led a Victor Mental Nature Tour guide trip with Denver Holt and owls maybe 5-6 years ago. And Denver, anybody doesn't know Denver, he started the Owl Research Institute, which has been around for 30 years, 25, 30 years. And I was there at the end of the wrap up at the last day. And there was a couple other gentlemen I connected with on the trip. And we were having a discussion. And I floated the idea to Denver and the rest of the guys. And also some of these other people out there that love crossbills about the idea of launching some kind of crossbill or finch kind of research project. Along the lines of what Denver started many, many years ago. And everybody kind of thought it had some legs. Over time, a lot of people started, I should say a lot of people, but there were a couple handfuls of people that were traveling to actually collect crossbill data and recordings. And they were sending me recordings. People send me these recordings from all around the world. And, I identify them. And it started to get to the point where I was like, all right, I got to look into, can we find some money to support this project, or can we find some money to support at least, small grant to support travel around the project? And so that's where this kind of hatched. And we launched this thing last year. We could not have expected, we knew it was going to be a finch invasion or a finch eruption, but the birds just could not have cooperated any more magnificently than they did last year. We launched it with the Finch Research, or the Finch Winter Finch Forecast. Tyler Orr took over for Ron Pittaway last year. The Winter Finch Forecast is one of the more highly anticipated, bird articles of the year that comes out end of September every year. We want everybody to be part of this. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. It's why we landed on the name network after kind of bouncing it around for better part of a year or two, whether it was going to be initiative or institute or collaborative or what have you. We landed on network because we want everybody to be part of this thing. And it's dedicated to study conservation of finches and their habitats globally. The board of directors, I have a professor a director at Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Dr. Holger Klink. Bioacoustics, he's director of bioacoustics. He's provided ARU units for these the Grosbeak and crossbill projects that we're doing right now. We also there's a professor at UC Davis, Tom Hahn, that's on the board of directors. We're looking at a purple finch project right now, and also an Evening Grosbeak project. Tom actually was the third major researcher in North America on the crossbill scene in the late 80s, along with Jeff Roth and Craig Bankman that I talked about earlier. We also have Jamie Cornelius at Oregon State. We're doing some work with Ben Zuckerberg, University of Wisconsin, trying to see if we can look into have the southern ranges of finches over time retreated, which would have, again, some play, some interest for people in Pennsylvania. The finches have these eruptions have been less and less further south over time, but maybe we're on an upswing right now. So it's a collaborative network of finch enthusiasts, whether you're an artist, a citizen scientist, a recordist, an eBird user, an actual scientist, somebody that wants to be part of it as far as writing grants, what have you. We want everybody to be part of this thing. And we basically dedicated it to the founders. What we consider as the founders is Ron Pittaway kind of started this network when he started the Finch Forecast, 20-something years ago now. Ian Newton in the UK was also instrumental and kind of across the pond popularizing finches. He wrote the book Finches in 1973. And we want, like I said, everybody to become a part of this thing, whether it's share your expertise, make a donation, taking pictures, doing artwork, having students. I have like I said, I have UC Davis research lab is working on a couple papers right now. I know I've talked to Holly in the past about getting the Frontiers group also possibly involved. We want hopefully an educational group could become part of this as well. We're going to continue to build the tentacles of this thing and the arms of it in the hopes of bringing more and more people in and just making Finches even more popularized and interest for people. Last year, we did a tremendous amount we continue to do outreach, a lot of outreach as far as identifying hoary redpolls or this green morph pine siskin. People sent us a ton of photographs last year and recordings of crossbills and even grosbeaks to some degree. We want to plan. We're going to plan to fund student projects, and I have some potential donors that are interested. We want to connect, literally students at universities doing Finch projects and a donor developing a relationship with that student and being able to be part of that project, whether it's a smaller project, whether it's a postdoc, whether it's a PhD, whether it's a master's. We want to actually connect those dots. And the big part is we want to get people outdoors. Again, an ode to ornithotherapy. It's a big part of my general makeup of who I am. It was mentioned earlier. I have 10 years in social work. And right now, even I'm working with special needs populations, trying to instill more of an interest in them, getting them outdoors. I think, if we learned anything during COVID, the outdoors was kind of a safe haven for all walks of people, as far as being able to have some kind of guidance or some kind of grounding force during these last really kind of tough 2 years that we've been going through with COVID. So the North American project, Evening Grosbeak, I'm working with, continue to work with David and the various groups I mentioned earlier. We hope there's going to be possibly, this Evening Grosbeak recovery group we're starting. Hopefully we'll have some more to share along the lines with this in the next month or so. But hopefully there'll be more work being done on looking into evening grosbeaks and why the population declined. And is there a call type, a cryptic call type that is embedded in that group? There could be out west. We have ARU units, 40 of them actually, out for crossbills and evening grosbeaks. Jamie Cornelius at Oregon State has looked into survivability in finches in the wintertime as global climate change, as global climate, temperature has risen. There's concern that as rain events increase or ice events increase in the boreal, there could be loss of habitat. There could also be increased mortality because it's a lot harder to thermoregulate during the winter months. It's easier to thermoregulate with snow than it is rain. Finch Research Network, we were also asked to become part of a rosy finch working group, which is another species complex that is threatened. There's a pretty notable decline, particularly in the two southern rosy finches, brown-capped and brown or black rosy finch. And can we get better at predicting, the winter finch forecast from year to year? That's another thing we're hoping to maybe work on with Ben Zuckerberg and a bunch of others out there as well. So, as far as the Evening Grosbeak project, and I'd love to work with the various projects, whether it's Tom Hahn's group and the student Aaron Heyman that worked on Evening Grosbeaks on a PhD project, but he ended up kind of, going on and moving on into a professional job with a conservation group. But we're going to have these ARU units to see where the call types overlap, and are they assortatively mating? You know, what is leading to this decline in the population? Is there possibly differences in genetics of the call types? Nobody's really looked into that anytime recently. You know, and do they, you know, do types form mixed flocks during winter? It does seem, we do know enough that they do form mixed flocks in the wintertime to some degree, but do they do that during the breeding season as well? So, you know, the launch of FiRN was unbelievably successful. I could not, in my wildest dreams, imagined how much interest was going to be around it. Again, the birds, you know, just performed unbelievably well for us. We had over 1 million visits to the website in a year, which is pretty amazing for a startup. We presented more than 20 programs for various bird and nature-oriented groups like yourself. Supported the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program, the Evening Grosbeak Wintering Tracking Project. You know, obviously that's involved with other partners. Joined the Rosie Finch Working Group, published more than 40 blogs about finches, had 40 autonomous recording units. Again, they came from Cornell University. You know, and in the near future, we hope to become involved with conservation efforts around Hawaii's finches and honey creepers as well. Some other projects, you know, Alex Lamro and I hope to launch, if anybody out there wants to actually have a finch, you know, a guided tour for a week through the Pacific Northwest, starting around Crater and ending around Mount Rainier in Seattle, there is a trip you can sign up for, which would be a ton of fun if we get that off the ground. It's a partnership with the Finch Research Network. Some of the proceeds would go to the Finch Research Network to support these projects. The other thing is with the Finch Forecast, we just launched a shirt that's a Code 5 design. Seabird McKean, some of you probably know that name out there. He designed that shirt. We just launched that with the Finch Forecast on Sunday. Some of you probably heard, I know Julia bought a shirt, appreciate it. The forecast was so highly sought after in the shirt that the site crashed for about 80 minutes on Sunday. It was a little bit stressful day. Thank you, Matt Sarver out there, for talking me through some of that on Sunday. And just today we announced Lillian Stokes and I are working on a Stokes Guide to Finches of North America that will be out in the fall, September of 2023. Thanks again, if Lillian, you're in the crowd, thanks for putting some of this together. It's a pretty snazzy looking slide, in my opinion. So, and thanks to the Pennsylvania Society for Ornithology for having me talk tonight. And, you know, by all means, if you want to give, please do give to the Finch Research Network for these projects we're working on. We want to get a honey creeper project off the ground. We can also be found at Finch Masters on Facebook and on Instagram, actually. And the Finches, Eruptions, and Mass Crops Facebook group is pretty much the kind of the discussion board for the Finch Research Network as well. This kind of epitomizes my interest in finches. Some people have called me a loxiophile in that, you know, I just absolutely love crossbills, obviously. I don't know why that always does that. And let me go back again to it. But again, thanks for having me, everybody. That's all I have. I'm about at 50 minutes, a little over 50 minutes right now. I could take some questions, and I know if there's any remaining questions, we're going to have a breakout group that will delve into the whole eruptions thing some more in depth. But anyway, David, take it over.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Thank you for that awesome presentation. Lots of good material there to digest. And we do have a few questions. We have some time for that. I do want to mention that we are going to have a breakout room social hour following the question session for Matt. And one of those breakout rooms is winter finch eruptions, and Matt will be there for an hour, and you can ask him any questions you want about this presentation or anything finches, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to discuss it. We have a few questions in the chat, Matt,
You want
and
me to stop share right now so we could all see each other's faces, or no?
Yeah,